Good afternoon, welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch. For those of you who are joining us again, welcome back. For those of you who are new, welcome to The Conduit. My name is Paul Fonsale. I'm one of the co-founders of The Conduit, and to my right is, drum roll.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. I'm Melanie Jameson and very excited to be with you here, and thank you, Paul, for hosting us at The Conduit. Do you want to say a few words before we jump in about why The Conduit? Why have the climate champions convened in this space with our UN climate change high-level champion, Razan Al-Mubarak, and of course, Dr. Mohammed Mahilden, who we saw earlier today. Love to hear a few words about The Conduit before we get started.
Great. Well, as you know, The Conduit is a community of people who are passionate about positive social change. We set up this place because, well, really because of events like this, where a group of people with the passion and the desire and the resources and the willingness to move the world to a better and more sustainable place get together and try and figure it out in all of its complexity and difficulty, but are nevertheless radically optimistic about our capacity to achieve things within planetary boundaries. And I think all of us in this room have no illusions about the scale of the challenge that lies ahead, but I think we are equally passionate about trying to get things done and trying to embrace the world's great problems as really opportunities for solutions. So with that, I'm going to say a little bit about what this afternoon is all about. Organizers have written this out in very specific terms. So I'm going to read this out and then I'm going to translate it into English. So what it says is, welcome to Nature Positive for Climate Action. 2023 is a crucial year to invoke a step change towards integrating efforts to tackle both climate and biodiversity crises together. There is no way to meet the Paris Agreement's objectives without protecting nature. And in this afternoon session, we're going to do 4 things. The first is we're going to demonstrate that the required actions to deliver an integrated, nature-positive, net zero economy are achievable, desirable, and are gathering momentum across policymakers, businesses, and the financial sector. So it's possible to do it, and we can get there in a nature-positive and net zero way. 2, we're going to encourage connectivity and explore synergies between business and investor initiatives. So we're going to figure out how amongst ourselves we can connect and we can collaborate. Thirdly, we're going to show how targets, frameworks, collaboration, and tools can enable tangible progress on the ground, and the necessary shifts towards a nature-positive economy can play out across the entire value chain. So we're going to show how targets and frameworks can promote collaboration rather than impede collaboration. And then finally, we're going to emphasize that a shared nature-positive and climate action narrative that demonstrates the scientific and economic necessity and relevance of addressing land conversion to achieve net zero targets, reverse biodiversity, and, wait for it, here it comes, reverse biodiversity loss, and promote sustainable and equitable development. So those are 4 big things. They may seem wordy, but they're really, really important, and I believe that we will achieve it. We have some really powerful speakers here today who have lived experience, and I'm going to hand over to Mel to facilitate the next panel.
Thank you, Paul. So we're going to have some really exciting and honest conversations over the next couple of hours together, and we're going to hear from leaders in finance, business, and civil society really about this climate-nature nexus and why nature now, not later. And to kick us off with some opening remarks, we've got David Cooper, who's going to share a short message with us. He's the Acting Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, as we know them. And we've got a few short words from David.
Good day. Good day, and thank you for inviting me to open this session on the climate-nature nexus. Why is it important to address this nexus? Firstly, climate change is one of the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss. Without climate action, it will be impossible to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Secondly, action to protect forests and other ecosystems to maintain and enhance natural sinks of atmospheric carbon is an essential part of climate action. These ecosystems are highly efficient carbon sinks on land, in wetlands and at sea. But this action must be in addition to reducing emissions by phasing out fossil fuels. Thirdly, biodiversity or nature is our best ally in adapting to the impacts of climate change. We already see the combined effects of climate change and biodiversity loss across the world. Drastically changing weather patterns are creating unprecedented threats to our well-being, our food systems, water supplies, to the fundamental pillars of human society. Healthy ecosystems provide relief from heat waves and droughts, prevent floods and landslides, and are necessary for the productivity of our food systems. They offer countless opportunities for building resilience against climate change, and yet they themselves are under threat from climate change. At COP15, the world adopted a global biodiversity framework for concrete action on nature that also supports the Paris Agreement and its aspiration of keeping climate change within 1.5 degrees. Climate action is nature action. Nature action is climate action. And the time for action is now. I thank you.
Conversation started, and I'm delighted to invite to the stage Her Excellency Rizan Al Mubarak, UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP28. Rizan, please come and join me. I'm also delighted to welcome Manuel Pulgar Vidal, COP15 Action Agenda Champion for Nature and People. Manuel, take a seat and a microphone. Thank you. And we have virtually dialing in with us today, Jennifer Jing-Tali Kopuz. She's an Indigenous leader and environmental activist and Managing Director of Policy at Neoterre. And I think in a moment we'll have Jennifer pop up on the screen. Hi, Jennifer. I'm hoping you can hear us. So let's get started.
Yes, I can hear.
Great. Here we go. Hi, Jennifer. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. So I wanted to start, Rizan. We heard David talking about climate action is nature action, and nature action is climate action. And I'd really love to understand from you why working at this climate-nature nexus and tackling both together is so critical.
Thank you very much for having me again. For those who have listened to me this morning, apologies, you're going to have to listen to me once again. And I suppose, Manuel, perhaps we need to change our profile pictures because we were, well, at least I was around 20 years younger in that picture, but yes, it's the same person.
The consequence of the action.
Exactly. But I mean, the question, why nature? Really 3 concrete reasons, but there are many, many others. So we at COP28 this year are going to be witness to the global stocktake. So what so far has been the impact on our collective action with respect to emission reductions? And through that global stocktake, we will collectively know that we're far from where we need to be. So it's halving emissions in less than 7 years, which is a magnanimous ask. But when you start building the how, you realize that nature, you cannot do this without nature. So energy transition alone will not get us there. And as you've heard from the acting executive secretary of the CBD, also working on nature alone will not get us there. We need both. Nature will provide 30%, that is significant, of our mitigation requirements by 2030. Number 2, It's a technology that exists today. It exists at scale, and it exists where local communities need to live and need to thrive. It is also a significant tool for adaptation. More than half of the world's population today do not have the luxury to talk about mitigation. They need to live and thrive in a world that assists them to adapt to the changing climate. In fact, half of the world's population today suffer from the impact of climate change. So nature also can support adaptation. And it is where indigenous communities live and thrive. Today, though they represent 5%, and I hope that you can correct me if I'm wrong, 5% of the world's population, indigenous peoples are the guardians of 80% of biodiversity. So in terms of inclusivity, nature can be this bridge between climate change discourse, nature, indigenous peoples, and inclusivity. So for those reasons, and many, many others, what nature does to our economy, what nature does in terms of our identity and our humanity is one of the reasons why I, as high-level champion, am very dedicated to ensure that nature discourse and the climate change discourse sit very well together in this nexus.
Thank you, Razan. So, Manuel, I'd love to build on that, and I think we've heard from Razan the power in nature in terms of unlocking both the climate crisis and doing that in a just way. I'd love to ask you to really bring to life for us, you know, how can non-state actors, the businesses, the investors, the cities, the regions, really collaborate and play a part, particularly in achieving the global biodiversity framework and the Paris Agreement at the same time?
Thank you. I am so happy and well honored to be in today's event, to be with you, Razan. And nature, as it has just been mentioned by David, it is our strong ally to address the climate crisis. But we do need to put our part. We started this journey in 1992, in a time in which we used to think that we would move the Biodiversity Convention, the Climate Change Convention, and even the UNCCD all together. But unfortunately, we used to say, after more than 25 years, that the UNCCD and the UNCBD were the poor cousins. And that is not correct. We must not treat those conventions as our poor cousin. Fortunately, we have gotten a new opportunity, and it is our hands to give the traction, the needed traction, to put all those conventions at the same level, well-framed because of the SDGs. And again, we have to do our part. And with Razan, we are preparing something that I hope, Razan, that soon we can share with you all. It is not a slide, it is just a page, a paper. Seems to be a sun. No? And what it is reflecting, it is those opportunities through which we can do our part. Because it is not only because of the action agenda on climate and nature, or the champions of the action agenda. It is all the actors working together. So let me describe 2 or 3 of the key elements to promote that convergence. The first one, it is probably one of the most important that we are used to forgetting. Just follow the science. The science is telling us that we have to connect our climate effort with our nature efforts. And we have seen, because of the IPCC and the IPBES reports, that a strong connection in between both. We have seen it when we read the land report and the oceans and the cryosphere, how important it is to consider ecosystem to address the climate crisis. So let's follow the science. Science is telling us what to do. And fortunately, science is giving to us, or proposing to us, solutions. So we have to follow those solutions. But Razan also mentioned something that probably for nature we are forgetting. Let's be more active in connecting nature with the economy. we were so effective and so instrumental in doing that. I remember the strong role that RRI played when they led this Global Commission for Climate and the Economy. And that commission has been closed because they got the success. Because now, for everybody, it is clear that climate and the economy are exactly the same. But we are not in the same when we think about nature. So we were talking with Razan that probably a climate and nature commission for the economy must be developed as a way to develop that narrative. Because unfortunately, that is not happening in our countries, mostly in the developing world. We are not understanding the strong role that nature has in our own economies and in the future for our own development. That moves me to the third element, that it is plans and policies. So we know, and we are trying to strengthen, and that is why the global stocktake, the NDCs, and I will refer to the global stocktake in a minute, and I won't take too much time. But we do need to continue strengthening the NDC and adding more nature into the NDC, and that is why the importance of the global stocktake. But what about the NBSAPs? Probably the poor of the poorest cousins of the public policies in our countries, in the domestic level. And fortunately, the Global Biodiversity Framework has encouraged us to produce new NBSAPs as a way that we can follow it, fulfill it, track progress, and get success of the NBSAPs. But it is not only about those two instruments, it is also about national adaptation plans, because adaptation, it is strongly related to nature and to climate, for sure. And unfortunately, by now, just 32 or 33 countries have prepared and adopted a national adaptation plan. That is a bit sad. We are 200 countries of the world. Just 33 have developed those plans. And also we have the long-term strategies, our vision for 2050, in which many countries are strongly behind the others. And that is our vision for the future. That is the way in which we can address that future. And also we can use the opportunities that conventions are bringing to us. Remember, friend, COP25 and COP26, two good clauses that connect well nature with climate. The point it is, how can we build upon those recognitions? Because in some way, the process has already given to us the mandate to build upon. So we don't want to repeat again that clause in COP28, but probably it would be possible to be more concrete and to start to connect. Also, have you ever wondered how much climate can contribute to the 30 for 30? Because when we think about the 30 for 30, that it is a target for the CBD, we are talking about 10 more points of coverage for conservation purposes in 7 years. So the CBD won't be able to do it alone. The only way to do it is by working together, climate and nature, to cover that 10 more points, not only through protected areas, but also through the other effective conservation measures, the OECM, or indigenous territories. So also there is a strong opportunity there. And let me finish talking about the global stocktake and why it is so important. Because the global stocktake, it is the only way through which we can improve the system and we can put NDCs well on track to our objective. Remember that the Paris Agreement adopted a ratchet mechanism through which we can, in every cycle of the NDCs, be more effective, not only in defining our plans, but achieving it. The point it is that by now we know that the current NDCs are not enough. We know that many countries even are not fulfilling with their own pledges. The point it is that the global stocktake must be a way to improve NDCs, and by improving NDCs to achieve the Paris Agreement objective. So ask yourself, what can we do to add to the global stocktake outputs? Because it is not about the process, forget the process. It is about the outcomes. What we are expecting by COP28, it is good outcomes that can make us able to improve the NDCs. So how much we can add nature to the outcomes of the global stock take to have better connected nature and climate. So I have just referred to 5 or 6 points of the 14 points of this graphic. But the idea is that it is in each of us hands to develop actions that can make us able to fulfill with the core of the sun, to have a world that can be net zero, resilient, and nature positive. That is, by the end, our objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. So my sense is a lot of people are going to come up to you after to have a look at that sun and want to know the rest of the points. And I think...
It is secret.
Top secret. Soon. And I'd like to come back to you two in a moment. So Roseanne and Manuel, I'm going to give you a little heads up that we're going to hear from Jing, and then I'd love to come to each of you to ask you to bring some of this to life with an inspiring example. Manuel, you talked about bringing nature into the outcomes that come to COP28. And I'm going to invite you to share what that could look like soon. But for now, I'd really love to turn to Jing and bring you into our conversation. And I'd really love, we heard Roseanne talk about the fact that you might let us know whether it's 5% of the global population, Indigenous peoples, of course, managing up to perhaps 80% of our biodiversity. And so I think it's really wonderful that you're able to join our conversation today. And I'd love to ask you, how can we ensure that Indigenous peoples and local communities are at the heart of climate action, and also ensuring that finance goes to the right places? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks very much for this opportunity. And my apologies that I couldn't join you in person. It's always an issue with visas and also health, the toll that travel takes on our health as international activists. So, in fact, Indigenous peoples have already been contributing and conserving and protecting our territories for millennia. And the role and contributions of Indigenous peoples is no longer in dispute. The science has shown that about 24 to 28% of total above-ground carbon is stored in Indigenous peoples' territories, and about 1/3 of the land, the Earth's land, is conserved by Indigenous peoples, despite the fact that only 40% of those lands have been declared formally as protected areas. So we have been contributing to solutions to the global crises, despite all of the threats that we face in our territories. What I'd like to say right now, building on what both Razan and Manuel have said about how we need to address both climate and nature together, is that when you go down to the level of Indigenous territories, and if you look behind me, my background, that's actually my community. It's an aerial shot of my community. You'll see in many Indigenous communities, whenever we govern and manage our lands and waters, we do not distinguish between actions that would contribute to climate mitigation, to climate adaptation, and to biodiversity conservation. It's all the same for Indigenous peoples. The point I would like to make, however, is that at this point, most of the global agreements, including the Paris Agreement, the Kunming-Montréal Global Biodiversity Framework, the agreement on REDD+, everything includes a recognition that it's necessary to get the consent of Indigenous peoples before any activity, whether it's a climate solution, biodiversity solution, can take place in Indigenous territories in cases where these activities impact the rights or the land of Indigenous peoples' territories. However, the point I would like to make is that we need to move beyond safeguards, because when you say safeguards, it means that this is sort of a barrier towards, for action that would solve the crises, for activities that would lead towards solutions to the biodiversity and climate crises. We need to move beyond regarding Indigenous peoples as a box to tick in this long list of requirements. We are full partners in the solutions, and our contributions need to be recognized as such. So There was a step in the right direction in December when we had the Kunming-Montréal Global Biodiversity Framework. In the climate space, it was much earlier than that when we established the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. These instruments move beyond safeguards and recognize Indigenous peoples as full partners in achieving our goals and in solving the crises that are facing us. Therefore, Indigenous peoples need to be included in all steps. Unfortunately, as Manuel said, we need to revise again the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. What we are doing now as Indigenous peoples is mobilizing to make sure that we are part of that process. And beyond the planning, the NDCs, the NAPs, the NBSAPs, we also need to be part of the implementation and later even the monitoring. And when we talk about actions, we have to talk about resources and finances. So one of the strongest strands of discourse of Indigenous peoples now is the need to ensure direct access of Indigenous peoples to finance, whether it be biodiversity finance or climate finance. This finance needs to be aligned with Indigenous peoples' priorities. We have to identify the Indigenous-led funds where these finances can be channeled. There need to be steps taken towards simplifying process and accessibility for bilateral and multilateral funds. And as Indigenous peoples, we are in the process of determining what percentage of these funds should go directly to Indigenous peoples. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to an opportunity to present concrete examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Jing. So let's start with you, Jing, as your mind is already going to examples. And I'll say we have 1 minute each. And I'm just going to ask if you just share your most inspiring example that you're excited about personally. And we'll know that everybody's taking notes and can go and search out for more information later. Jing, tell us your exciting example.
Yes, I would talk about the Amazon because this is one of the areas that has been identified as very important for both climate and biodiversity. But many people are already talking about that, Indigenous peoples there, especially in Brazil. We can see the 4 indigenous territories recently recognized, and we hope that continues because it's important in order to get to the solutions. But for me, it's in Asia, we are doing that as well. We are identifying the parts of our territories that we would like to commit to conservation and carbon sequestration, climate mitigation. And we have established an Indigenous Peoples of Asia Solidarity Fund. And we are then in the process as well of identifying organizations, Indigenous peoples organizations that have the capacity to absorb finances in order to help Indigenous peoples on the ground to continue to identify parts of our territory that we would like to dedicate to climate and biodiversity solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jing. Thank you. Over to you, Manuel, and then Roseanne.
Wow, it's difficult because I have like 4 examples, but I will...
But one and brief.
Okay. One example, because currently exists, and it is perfect for the future, nature-based solutions. And remember always that nature-based solutions, it is, and it could be a great mechanism if we are able to respect that it refers to 3 main values. To keep biodiversity integrity and ecosystem integrity, that is key. So if your intervention on nature won't keep that, it is not nature-based solutions. The second one, it is that it must address a societal challenge, that it could mean climate, water security, food security, disaster risk management, and it must be a well-documented challenge in sense of it is not that you can invent it. It is well-documented, and with your intervention, you will address. And the third one, it is that it must be inclusive. That means that it must be a right-based approach, and it must create social benefits. So there are many good examples. For me, conservation efforts, green infrastructure examples are what the world needs to develop as a way to integrate climate and nature.
Thank you, Manuel. And Roseanne?
First of all, I take great inspiration from you, Jing, and thank you. Thank you for reminding us that things across the board should not be tokenized. Nature conservation within the climate change agenda should not be tokenized. Climate change within the nature agenda should not be tokenized. And I think we need to lean on the wisdom of Indigenous peoples that have always seen these two issues as one of the same, one of the same coins. And so as practitioners, as participants in the race to zero and to race to resilience, my big ask is to include nature as an ally to the 1.5 degree pathway, and those that are engaged in supply chains and financing to ensure that we stop commodity-driven deforestation in everything that we do. And so those are my two asks, and I hope that I've stayed within the 1 minute in doing so.
Beautiful closing words. Thank you, Razan, Manuel, and Jing.
Okay, we are going to go straight into our next panel. Our next panel is on accelerating action by increasing connectivity of climate and nature target setting, disclosure standards, and planning frameworks. And if the panelists can come and join us up on stage. Gina Gambetta is a journalist working for Responsible Investor. Jane Madgwick, Executive Director of the Global Commons Alliance. Mahesh Roy, Director of Investor Practices at the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change. And Thomas Viegas.
And thank you for
spooks in the machine. Thomas Viegas, who is Partnerships Lead at the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Over to you, Gina.
Hello everyone, and so thank you for joining us for this next session where we're going to be diving into how we can accelerate action by increasing the connectivity and collaboration between climate and nature, target setting, disclosure standards, planning frameworks, and engagement initiatives. So basically going through the alphabet acronym soup of TCFD, TNFD, SBTI, SBTN, CM100+, NA100, and as I said, my name is Gina, and I'm the nature reporter for Responsible Investor. I'm very, very privileged to be here today. But we haven't got much time, so I'm going to dive right in. I know you guys have already all been sort of introduced, but if you could each introduce yourself again and say a little bit about your work in the nature space and sort of where it's at right now. Jane.
Thank you, Gina. Hello, everybody. So I'm Jane Madgwick. I'm the first executive director of the Global Commons Alliance, which has an enormous ambition. The Alliance aims to safeguard the global commons, and that is all the interconnected systems, land, water, nature, air, ocean, which all life depends on. So this is a fast-growing coalition. It's still in early stages, but we have the ambition to become really like an ecosystem of players that's truly global and representative around the world, and aiming to equip citizens, cities, companies, countries with what they need in terms of the scientific basis, so the knowledge, the tools, the guides, and the accountability systems to become these effective stewards of the global commons. Very briefly, just a couple of weeks ago, the Earth Commission launched the newest scientific insights into the Earth system boundaries. So that's a big update on planetary boundaries because it brings in the safe and just analyses together. Science-Based Target Network launched their 1.0 release, a few hundred pages, and 17 companies are road testing that. Systems Change Lab have been busy mapping out all the systems that needs to be transformed. And now they're homing in on where are the positive tipping points, which systems need to work together most. And the Accountability Accelerator is mapping out and shortly to publish, what's the state of that whole forest of standards and frameworks, and how can we simplify this and get public access to this and a way to see the wood for the trees, if you like. And lastly, Earth HQ is the kind of megaphone communications part of the Alliance. And is really expanding its reach around the globe with investigative journalism, but also bringing the insights of the science to people in an understandable way. So really exciting times for the Alliance. Thank you.
I'm Mahesh Roy. I'm the Director for Investor Practices at IIGCC. The Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, as the name suggests, works with investors. We have 400 investor members representing about $60 trillion in assets. We've been around for about 20 years, and some of the things we're known best for are initiatives we help launch, like Climate Action 100+, which is the largest engagement with the real economy on climate action and net zero, as well as the net zero asset managers, the Paris-aligned asset owners, for which we built the Net Zero Investment Framework, which is the most widely used target setting and transition plan guidance for net zero that investors use. Right now, literally right now, we are launching Nature Action 100+. Not me right now, but my colleagues are on a separate webinar. And so what we're essentially looking to do there is to build off the platforms of those initiatives, those sort of the world's leading initiatives as far as climate goes, and build out into nature. So look at the intersection of nature and climate, and then build out through corporate engagement and engagement with the assets that investors hold, and then to build target and guidance and transition plan guidance, both in net zero and climate resilience, that integrates nature, firstly at the nexus between the two, and then building out more broadly into those themes. Thanks.
First, I just want to say thank you to the high-level climate champions and the conduit for this event and for a brilliant day with a workshop this morning. My name is Thomas Viegas. I'm Partnerships Lead at the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. And what the TNFD is doing in a nutshell, we're a market-led, science-based global initiative that is designing and will deliver a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations, namely businesses and financial institutions, to be able to report and act on their nature-related issues. I said deliver, and I want to underscore deliver because the task force is coming out with its final disclosure recommendations this September, so watch this space. And our ultimate aim is to help support a shift in global financial flows towards nature-positive outcomes.
So yeah. A key question, obviously, for today is, how do we break the silos between nature and climate, and really show that climate actions are stronger and more resilient when you bring nature into the fold. And I mean, don't worry, I'm not going to ask any of you guys to come up with the silver bullet solution for that. But it'd be great, if you can just give your sort of thoughts on the importance of this and how we can start looking at this. And kind of as a part two of the question, I mean, not obviously, but SBTN, TNFD, NA100 are kind of the sisters, successors of climate initiatives. So it'd be great to understand kind of the alignment and similarities you have with your predecessors, but then how you kind of adapted them for the nature context, although a lot of alignment, they are different issues in some ways. And just the kind of collaboration and communication you've had with your climate counterparts. But once again, start with Jane and go down.
So the Global Commons Alliance really, well, it isn't an organisation, it's an alliance, and is always looking to build on what all its partners have done. So in all that I've mentioned earlier, we were building on, for example, the work of SBTI in bringing forward the targets for nature. We're working with TNFD, looking at the accountability frameworks and bringing together this public data utility. Also with the climate champions to marry nature and climate. So it's really, we're trying to make the link between the partners. But I want to say something about where we're going and some of the big gaps that we need to fill. So I mentioned, the safe and just Earth system boundaries that are, I mean, this is not just a small addition to bring social justice alongside environmental security. This is a new frontier. And for the Alliance, and perhaps for many organisations here, we really need to think, what does this mean in practice? Bringing justice into the sustainability science, recognising the interdependence of people and planet. I mean, in a sense, has been said, the message is coming through that without nature we can't do climate. But essentially we're saying without people we can't do nature. So this has big implications for partnerships, for example. We need in the Alliance development and humanitarian partners to work with us, representatives of Indigenous communities too. And we're founded on, really strong science base, really rigorous science, which is important, but there is a place alongside that for traditional knowledge and indigenous wisdom. And we need to figure out how to bring this in to inform the future actions. And we need the metrics to build justice into nature-based solutions, as Manuel was mentioning just now. I don't think we have this yet, and this is a new frontier we need to work together to build. And indeed to go beyond safeguards and really look at the transformations across landscapes, cities, countries, regions. And in terms of collaboration, I think, well, there's literally a forest of acronyms, I still don't know them all, and tools and products branded various ways. We need to go beyond this. We need a systems approach to our collaboration, even if we're going to address the Earth systems. So the Alliance is really looking at forging, convening new partnerships across sectors and across scales, and perhaps putting up there that we need to work towards some kind of one-stop shop approach. So interoperability between those tools and data sets that are held by so many players that's fragmented around the world. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty hard to accelerate action, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so talking about breaking the silos, I think with investors, it's more about broadening their view. So for investors, when talking about things like climate and nature, it's about pricing in externalities into their risk calculations. And so far, for climate, that's been carbon emissions. That's the main metric that's been able to do a lot of that work. That said, with 20 plus years of sort of action on that metric, we're still far from perfect. But climate action and the net zero investment framework is centred around engaging and measuring progress on carbon or carbon equivalent emissions. And I guess the first and most logical corollary to that was carbon sinks. And so forests and trees were then brought into the equation for things like offsets and nature-based solutions. And that's sort of where we're at, or where we've been at up until recently. So if you then broaden that view and say, what does excess carbon in the atmosphere actually do? What does it affect? What is the transition mechanism in creating an economic cost to these assets that they invest in? And the answer is nature. It's because climate is part of the biosphere. So are humans, of course, even though we try to deny it. And for example, lots of those channels come through physical climate risk manifesting, and that can involve water often. Too much of it, too little of it, moving at rapid speeds, and then suddenly you can expand even more and say, okay, well, water's important. I don't think that's priced in, or that hasn't probably been priced into the way we're looking at risks and opportunities. And perhaps trees, they don't just sequester carbon, they cool down urban environments, they provide resilience in coastal areas, and you can see broader economic benefits, and therefore you can start to go back to that original place where we started with climate action and start engaging with assets and companies on their impacts and dependencies beyond carbon in those same conversations that you're having with them when you're already engaged with them. And I think investors are at various stages of broadening that view, which is why we see the increased interest. And it sort of explains the areas we'll be covering in Nature Action 100 Plus and integrating nature into our investment frameworks, building out from those logical intersections. And in climate, we've got wonderful collaborations. Race to Zero, we had a workshop upstairs before, and similarly afterwards we had the nature workshop. So we just need to continue those collaborations on an ongoing basis as we broaden our view.
Thanks. Just to underscore a point which I think is really important that was mentioned in the last panel in the video at the start. Scientifically, climate and nature is inherently interlinked, and it's we, humanity, that have decoupled these issues. For business and finance in particular, climate and nature have been running on different lanes, to use the race analogy, and that's meaning in terms of work, understanding, and action in terms of how both pose economic consequences and financial risk. But, and again, to go to the race analogy, I think the nature agenda can pick up the baton from climate, and that's what we've been doing in TNFD. So in particular, TNFD, one of our core design principles has been to build off TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures work, and we found that imperative for 3 reasons. One is to maximize the consistency in language and approach of the TCFD. The second is to help promote swift and widespread adoption of the TNFD when we publish our final recommendations in September. And third and finally, it is to support this broader shift towards an integrated approach. I go back to my point at the start. We decoupled climate and nature for the planet. The planet can't wait for us to do climate first and nature second. The planet works in an integrated way, and ultimately our response and actions must be in an integrated manner. And so we in TNFD actively are supporting this integrated approach, and that's what's really at the core of our framework.
Thank you. And yeah, going back to Mahesh for a second, and continuing this vein that climate action's more resilient when you get nature involved. I know for you it's really important that we bring the concept of nature into climate transition plans. And I mean, you know, transition plans are kind of a hot topic right now in ESG. In the UK alone, obviously, we've got the Transition Plan Task Force. So yeah, it'd be great if you can, you know, explain a little bit more the importance of, you know, bringing nature in now into these transition plans, and yeah, any work you're particularly following.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And so if transition plans are sort of the culmination, that's sort of the, I guess, the hot topic in sort of net zero and climate now that targets have been set and commitments have been made, these strategies are sort of the maturation of all of that work. So it's only logical that this new development should broaden the view beyond emissions, because this strategy will be implemented in the physical world. So it's going to be done in the biosphere, and there'll be impacts and dependencies on nature on the basis of this climate action that say investors and the real economy are undertaking. So how will you manage those risks and opportunities that arise from nature and climate action? And the other quick thing I'll mention, involved somewhat in transition plans, but not necessarily net zero ones, is work on climate resilience, particularly in the the business and financial world, which is once again pretty far behind. Our climate resilience investment framework and the physical climate risk assessment methodology work that we're taking on from the Coalition for Climate Resilience Investment, physical climate risk really drives home the centrality of nature in the climate challenge. So we're looking at finding ways and financial mechanisms that make nature the preferred adaptation and resilience solution when investors are starting to integrate physical climate risk into their investment decisions, instead of just building big seawalls or other human interventions that we're trying to engineer. How can we go back to building nature into resilience?
And I guess now, sort of turning to the future, I'm going to ask you all to make a bit of a promise here. Don't worry, I'll probably hold you to it. But, how will you all, in your sort of various spheres of influence, continue to drive further collective action and collaboration between these two issues? And I guess, more broadly, how do you see this nexus of climate and nature sort of further evolving going forward? And we can start with Thomas and then come back this way.
Sure, thanks. So first to say, we have two North Stars. As was mentioned in the last panel, we have the Paris Agreement and we have the Kunming-Montréal Agreement. They've given us a clear direction in terms of finish line, and both of them have underscored that in able to transition to a net zero and nature positive outcome-based world, we need collective action from governments, businesses, financial institutions, and broader society. Within the realm of business and finance, the TNFD's work and role is clear. We're providing that risk management and disclosure framework to help organizations report, disclose, and act. And specifically, I think into your point about collaboration, nature is very complex. We all know that. We all know that in this room. But we need to cut through that complexity. The TNFD allows for that and make it decision useful for businesses. We do not need all businesses and financial institutions to be trained ecologists. I dare say that would be too hard and too ambitious. But what we do need is for them to be champions to embed climate and nature into their operations activities, into their stakeholder engagement. And TNFD is a tool, is a framework, is a set of recommendations which will allow for that.
So when talking about collaboration, I need to make sure that I'm not breaking any competition laws and, talking about providing the best guidance for investors and businesses to make their own decisions. But I think even on that point, or somewhat I'm taking on from that point, we'll continue to work with our member base on what's made us successful over the past 20 years in building out these solutions. And I think we need to move intentionally and while scaling as rapidly as possible. We need to not stretch ourselves beyond what we know to that point. I've spent over 20 years in the finance industry. I am not an ecologist. I will never be. There's a reason why I'm not, because I'm not smart enough and don't know enough. And I think that we need to not stretch ourselves beyond what's known and commit too far. Ecosystems aren't necessarily going to translate into financial models easily, and we don't want to over-financialize ecosystems either, because generally that can lead to bad results. So I think we need to learn from, some of the, I won't say mistakes, but some of the learnings that have been made in sort of climate action in the private sector, and focus initially on areas with the most impact and ones that are adjacent to what we're doing as opposed to trying to boil the ocean, which we're already sort of unfortunately doing already at the moment.
Jane?
So I think I should start by saying Mahesh and I should have a long conversation, because I am an ecologist and don't know a lot about finance. So I think we could do a long way to build some bridges. There's a rapidly closing window of opportunity. That's what we know from earth science, to avoid the dangerous tipping points, but also really an opportunity to ensure there is a safe and just future for the planet. So we have the numbers on that. We know where we need to get to. It's not just the direction of travel. We know exactly where we need to get to. I think this is motivating. And the Global Commons Alliance will therefore do everything we can to move the global community together for this. Three things. Firstly, think beyond climate, think beyond even climate and nature, because it doesn't make sense, just climate and nature. If you go to a city or a landscape or even a country, we have to take into account the Earth systems. So water, nutrients, etc. We have to look at the systems approach. We need to move towards that holistic approach pretty quickly. We must factor people into this as part and parcel at the heart of the actions and bring the metrics along. Last point, work together across sectors, even within sectors. There's much space for working better together, but across sectors especially, and across scales, because without that real collaboration, we're not going to get there. So let's reach out to our neighbours with different disciplines, listen and respect, and find the synergy in that. Thank you.
And I guess one final question, and to a bit of a call to action. What advice, would each of you sort of give to an institution who, has maybe been doing a bit on climate for the last few years, but they're early on in their nature journey? What can they start looking at? What can they start doing? And how can they start, even from the beginning, try and align this work on nature with the stuff they've done on climate? Once again, start from Thomas and then come down. But yeah, 1 minute each.
Sure,
Please.
I'll try and fit this in. 3 points from me. First, to act is to adopt, and that means adopting the TNFD's final disclosure recommendations that come out in September. But you don't need to wait till September. You don't need to go on holiday if you don't want to. You can already start beta test or piloting our beta framework and join the 200 plus organizations that are already doing so. And that gets me to my second point, which is just get started. The TNFD is providing tools, guidance, and recommended disclosures. They're in draft form. Our alignment with TCFD means you can already start on your nature journey if you're doing TCFD, and you can already plan for the more challenging parts of a TNFD disclosure. Third and finally is overcoming what I would call FOMO, and that's the fear of mucking up. So on the climate space, what we've seen is that FOMO, or the fear of missing out, was really positive to get companies, get organizations on their way to start working and acting on this issue. More recently, what started to creep in, I think, in the broader environmental space of this fear of not doing much because you don't want to be attacked. And greenwashing, obviously, as all of us know, is a very serious and credible threat, and there are relevant bodies looking at this very closely. But for any organization, you shouldn't be put off, and you need to get on that journey. And to use the race analogy for the final time, some of us may trip and stumble on this journey to nature positive and net zero, but it's how we pick ourselves up, how we collaborate and support each other that ultimately will matter, because we need to get to the finish line together.
Thanks. In Australia, we call that FOFU. It's just a little bit different. But I would say, I'll be very quick. I'll just say, particularly for investors, just look at adjacencies. And most people that work in finance would know, if you want to sort of build out a new product or a new strategy, always go adjacent. Don't go out into the open water where you don't know what you're doing. And that's probably a good way for financial institutions to look at integrating nature, see where the adjacencies are. And so before deep diving into biodiversity metrics and indicators, which will be coming out, and you will learn how to integrate into your work over time, maybe start with something like looking at physical climate risk and the impacts and dependencies of nature therein.
Final word, Jane.
Yeah, so I would say to any leader, mayor, CEO, the risk of inaction is too high. And there is no excuse now because the guidance is out, the targets are there, there's no end of help just there. So take the first step and maybe find one or two really good partners to work with, to lead your hand through the forest, but take the next step. But towards a very ambitious target. Work out where you need to get to take the next step.
Perfect. Well, thank you to my amazing panelists, and thank you all for listening.
So thank you to Gina, Mahesh, Jane, and Thomas. So we've heard so far why the climate-nature nexus is imperative to unlock progress towards a net zero, just, regenerative future. We've spent time understanding the connections that's required across standards, targets, and frameworks. And now we're going to dive into value chain engagement. And we're going to look with openness and empathy to really understand what does it take to involve all actors in the value chain to accelerate net zero action, to tackle biodiversity loss, and to halt deforestation. And I'm delighted to welcome Sue Reed to moderate the next session from Global Optimism. She'll be joined by Jose Pugaz from JGP Asset Management, Rashila Karai from Rebecco, and Dr. Gods Martin from Golden Agri Resources, and Marcelo Bahar from Natura & Co. We'd love you to come and join. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Let's take a moment. So we're shifting gears a little bit, and sorry that we're missing a quick break right now, but we promise to keep it lively here, and obviously feel free to grab some coffee or water if you need to. And thank you for that warm welcome, Melanie. You've already introduced our panelists. We are going to shift gears to value chain engagement, as you saw from the title of this session. Value chain engagement to accelerate net zero action, halt deforestation, and tackle biodiversity loss. That's massive. And we're really excited that we have here today a rich mix of voices from both the investor community and from non-financial corporations that are working with exactly these challenges and opportunities. I'm going to start with Jose Pugaz, who is with us virtually, not by the miracles of modern technology, but because of human ingenuity that went into people deciding they needed to make the ability to communicate virtually actually happen. I hope the sound and everything will work now that I've said that. That what we can solve these kinds of challenges is emblematic here. And also emblematic is that Jose Pugaz was planning to join us in person, but is in the trenches in Brazil with just too much in terms of opportunities to make a difference on the ground there. So he unfortunately is not with us today, but for the planet, we're really grateful that he's continuing this crucial work on the ground. Jose is head of ESG at JGP Asset Management and a partner. Can you say a few words to open us up in terms of what you are doing, what JGP Asset Management is doing with regard to tackling deforestation specifically, just a subset of these issues across your value chains, across all of your investment portfolio. Thank you.
Sure, so that sounds okay? Okay, perfect. So, well, yes, we are on the trenches here, sorry. I was really thrilled to be with you this week. But things are going quite fast here in Brazil on the adaptation for green finances. So it's a wonderful moment to be Brazilian. So we have to enjoy as much as possible. Well, here at JGP Asset Management, we are highly concentrated in Brazil. So it's a fact that we have to assure. So discussing deforestation is not an option for us. It's an obligation. We have engaged with the main Brazilian commodity companies over the past 2 years in a constant effort to raise awareness about the economic and financial risks of remaining in production chains based on deforestation. Despite the very negative political mood in Brazil during these 2 years of pressure, the response were unanimous in the sense of transitioning to models of production and consumption of commodities free of deforestation of any kind. legal or illegal, as a basic condition for competitiveness. This year, the political mood is totally different. And yesterday, we already had the publication of the first numbers regarding deforestation in the Amazon in 2023. In the first half of 2022, we have a total of almost 4,000 square kilometers of deforested areas in the Amazon. This year, the number is slightly above 2,200 square kilometers, the first drop since 2017, and a return to the 2018 scenario. Although illegal deforestation, which primarily occurs in the Amazon, is sharply declining, the Cerrado numbers continue to worry us. It is time then to adapt ourselves to the new context of effective government combat deforestation. This new behavior that JGP is adopting is to stop sending letters and start sending money. The regenerative transition to the establishment of deforestation-free production models depend on money, and a lot of it. Each hectare of restoration with agroforestry demands more than $15,000, and for the recovery of degraded pastures in areas of regenerative agriculture, the cost is more than $6,000 per hectare. At JGP alone, we are developing 15 productive restoration and regenerative agriculture projects for this year alone, totaling more than $200 million in new depth operations. Furthermore, we are establishing 3 new planted finance and corporate venture philanthropy funds for Brazilian companies to help them transition to a green economy. Our strategy's prospective pipeline already includes more than 50,000 hectares of reforestation, an unprecedented effort in the Brazilian financial sector. It means that we are changing also the addresses of letters that we previously sent to Brazilian companies. We are no longer writing to commodity producers, but to their counterparts in the Global North, as well as the governments of consumer countries. The Global North is in charge of enforcing regulations to combat greenwashing and ensure corporate climate transparency. Without Scope 3, there's no climate transparency. And I must assure that because ignoring Scope 3 means ignoring deforestation and the Global South. And I want to emphasize that those regulations must be implemented in collaboration with us at the Global South, because there is already a substantial pipelines of projects underway. And to finish, without a regenerative and carbon neutral Brazil, there is no regenerative and carbon neutral food industry in the world. Brazil is ready to lead the transition to zero deforestation. Exporting companies and the financial market are committed to ethical values and recognize that combating both legal and illegal deforestation is the only way to ensure business continuity. We need our international counterparts, particularly those in commodity trading and finance, to commit to actions that have a real impact on the ground rather than just on their consensus and on sustainability reports. So thank you, Sue.
Thank you so much for that, Pugas. I was hearing a lot about addressing risk and opportunity, the role of regulation, and importantly, a certain level of maturity in terms of state of play with investors who are grappling and companies who are grappling with these issues, and hopefully policymakers as well. And hopefully we can come back to unpack some of those elements, including the nature positive investment, nature-based solutions investment pieces. I'd love to stick with investment community voices for now and turn to Rashila with Robeco. If you could let us know your thoughts in terms of, at a high level, how Robeco is approaching tackling deforestation across your investments. And I can't help but flag both Robeco and JGP are very active members with Finance Sector Deforestation Action Initiative that was launched at COP26 at Glasgow. And this cadre of several dozen investors have been really putting their shoulders to the oar, tackling all elements of this equation: company engagement, investor expectation, scaling nature-based solutions investment. So really leading by example. So thank you for that, and would love to hear some words of wisdom.
Thank you. Well, I'll try to be wise. So good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that don't know Robeco, we are a global asset manager investing mostly in listed equities and fixed income. And so as a listed company, as an investor that invests in listed companies, what can we do to drive change in the companies that we invest in? And we really think taking an active ownership role is key to drive change. And it's key for us to also achieve our sustainability strategy and deliver on the commitments that we have. So we really believe in exercising our rights as shareholders to push companies to tackle the main issues that we think they should be tackling, and as investors, it's about creating value for them as well as creating value for us. So this is all about value creation and using the engagement lever to get there. So the way we approach defining which topics to engage on is it's an internal collective process. We talk to our portfolio managers, we talk to our sustainability analysts, and actually also to our clients to say what are the key topics that we need to address from a sustainability point of view. Then we narrow it down to 3 or 4 per year. And then we look at, okay, which are the companies in the value chain that are part of creating the biggest impacts, that have the potential to change, and let's focus on those 10 to 15 companies over a 3-year period with very specific milestones and actions that we want those companies to achieve. And at the end of those 3 years, we can measure against those milestones to see if we actually achieved the objectives that we set out to do. So that's what we do individually as Rebecca. And as you mentioned, we're also very active in and believe in the power of collective engagement, whether it be the finance sector for deforestation action, Nature Action 100, and others. And there we have the opportunity to amplify our voice. So it's not one single investor talking to one company, it's the investment community to say, hey, we believe these issues are important and we want to see some action in terms of addressing those. It's very efficient for companies. They're having the conversation once with several investors instead of multiple times. It's also efficient for us because we can share the workload in terms of how we work with those companies to drive change. And quite frankly, it also sends a signal to the market. So it's not just that company that we're talking to, but their peers, others in the industry, others in parts of the value chain to say, hey, you know, we as investors think this issue matters in this industry and we expect this type of action to address that. So maybe I'll leave it there to just kind of set the scene.
Wonderful, thank you. And we can come back to unpack some pieces of that. So let's shift gears a little bit again for moving on from investor perspectives, from those who presumably have had many conversations with investors over the years over these issues that are now expanding, right? So there's been a lot of engagement on deforestation, engagement on biodiversity and nature impacts more broadly is really, I think it's fair to characterize as more nascent, but we're very excited about all the tools that were just discussed on the last panel. So let's shift to Dr. Getz-Martin with Golden Agri Resources, Director of Sustainability. You, among other things, have tools like now the Traders 1.5C roadmap and so on. How are you approaching this and tackling deforestation across your supply chains?
Yeah, thank you, Sue. First of all, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for the organizers of this event to invite me. A quick word of who Golden Agri is. I'm a bit nervous. I'm actually of the dark side of the spoon. Yeah, so Golden Agri Resources is essentially one of the largest producers and traders of palm oil. We have a production footprint of roughly 500,000 hectares across Indonesia. However, we are also protecting 80,000 hectares of tropical rainforest within our concessions, and I guess I'm the only one who can say that here in this room. Maybe, I hope, no. No, so back, you know, interesting to listen to the discussion in the earlier sessions, and for a palm oil company, essentially, the whole nature discussion started actually before the climate discussion. So when I joined this industry in 2015, everything, or to some part it still is, was all about deforestation. And so then Golden Agri Resources, together with Greenpeace and the Earthworm Foundation, which was back then called the Forest Trust, we were creating or co-designing, if you will, the HCSA methodology, which kind of was used broadly by the palm oil industry to identify forests beyond the HCV concept. So essentially it led to a zero deforestation approach. And obviously I think what the beauty it's sometimes beauty, sometimes it's a pain, is in our position that we have a quite significant large supply chain. We have more than 450 companies supplying their products to us, and so we can use that market position, if you will, to request from our suppliers that they apply the same methodologies that we use. For example, HCSA, HCV assessments, and then also report accordingly. So you mentioned just, I think, a good tool to report because it's really a cross-commodity and also a cross-ecosystem approach is the NDPE IRF framework for reporting progress. Within the agribusiness roadmap, all the members have committed to achieve all their suppliers to be in the delivering category, which means they have all committed to zero deforestation and have the respective processes in place. So that's how we are trying to engage, using essentially our market power and then work with our peers to spread these news. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I hope we'll have a chance to come back and talk a little bit more about, in particular, engagement with smallholders, because that's a very complex set of challenges, but obviously need across these supply chains, activity and enablement at every level. So, Marcelo, you've been very patient joining us from Natura and Co. Tell us a bit about your experience, Natura and Co.'s experience tackling deforestation across your value chain.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. Good afternoon to everyone. Good morning to José, my colleague in Brazil, and to those who are listening to us in other geographies and have different time zones. And it's great to be here among friends, people that I met many times, and it's always good to be in a panel where when people start to talk, you understand all the acronyms, because it's a soup of acronyms, isn't it? And we are among peers, and I think it's okay for us to disclose some of those. Just to talk a little bit about who I am and what Natura & Co. represents and does for. So Natura & Co. is a Brazilian-based company founded 50 years ago. And I think I joined the company 10 years ago because it's the living proof that you can combine development with preservation. So it has been operating for 50 years. Back in 92, we had the first COP, the COP of COPs, the one that initiated the whole process, when climate and nature were only one topic. We had the Earth conference in Rio in 92, and the owners of Natura back then, they said, well, the country stopped for the Earth conference. Everyone paid attention. It was all over the news. And it was really important. Brazil was becoming aware of what was happening to the Amazon. And they said, how can we operate in a way that the business that we have, and they had a relatively small cosmetic business, could benefit from the Brazilian biodiversity and bring the Brazilian biodiversity into the products and engage with traditional communities doing things differently. And they took a lot of time and science to do that in a way that would be feasible for the regulations, not only in Brazil, but also to export overseas. And with that, we created many products out of different bioingredients, out of the traditional commodities. So now we have 42 different bioingredients, and we have targets not only for expanding the portfolio, so doing more with nature, but also how we connect with communities and how we do that, not only sourcing ethically, which is really important, but above that, how we really engage with the community. So being with them, with anthropologists, with people who can stay and go days, sometimes weeks by boats inside the rainforest to source properly, to bring them the technologies that they need to do that, to bring education, to bring health in a way that they are maintaining the land. And I think that's part of the discussions that we had today, is how to operate with traditional communities. I think moving forward, that will be one of the key elements for success. And I think Natura has been on that space at least since '98. So we've been tracking and we've been improving our metrics and our standards since then. And nowadays we are able to somehow work with the communities in a way that it preserves 2 million hectares of the Amazon forest, and we need to expand that until 2030 to 3 million hectares. Not enough, far from the task ahead, so we need to engage with many others to do the same so we can have the around 150 million hectares of the Amazon protected by an activity that can at the same time allow development for the region, and it's not only the people, right? So we have, there is an indigenous saying in the Amazon that the Amazon has more eyes than it has leaves, because you have so much life within the forest that we have to understand how traditional populations were able to build the biggest garden on earth in the last 10,000 years and moving forward on that same direction and not on a deforestation one. So I think that's where Natura is. Recently, Brazil was having a lot of difficulties on deforestation, and Natura stand against that movement. So we placed a tree counter in front of the Brazilian Congress, so we would give visibility of what was happening, and we would disclose alongside with our financial results how deforestation was being managed or poorly managed in Brazil in the recent years. So combining that with some of the elements that we heard today, and I think we can come back to that later, I think that practice can be expanded in haste and connect finally climate and nature moving forward.
Wonderful, thank you. I definitely want to come back to this, the role of regulation. There's a lot to unpack there, but the role of regulation in the mix. Maybe let's turn to that first. And Pugas, if you don't mind, it would be great to hear from you in terms of perspectives of voluntary or semi-voluntary, right? Like with financial and non-financial institutions, having to address material, financial, nature, and climate-related risks. It's not really voluntary, right? Like it's kind of essential in terms of bottom line resilience, but still, we've seen that voluntary action can only take you so far. So if you could say a few words, Pugas, about the role of regulation, I would love to hear a little bit more from further perspective in Natura. Enko.
Sure. When we talk about voluntary pledges, voluntary claims, it can't be irresponsible claims. That is the barrier that we must be always watching very closely. So regulations regarding, for example, greenwashing, it's critical. You look at kind of regulations happening in European Union, you will see a lot of litigations, a lot of claims in Australia currently because of green pledges, of being carbon neutral, of being zero deforestation. And those are critical because even if we have a very strong regulatory system regarding the barriers of emissions, some cap and trade regulations that we were adopting here in Brazil, if there is no oversight on the pledges of being regenerative, carbon neutral, you can't have a serious ecosystem for development. When we look at, for example, that 8 out of 10 of the largest food industries in the world, they pledge to be regenerative or carbon neutral or deforestation free till 2025 or till 2030, they're not doing anything to make that happen on the ground. They're not making the transitioning of their supply chains. So how they can be considered to be regenerative or carbon neutral or deforestation free if they're not supporting the transition of their supply chains in Brazil, in Indonesia, or anywhere else in the global south. So regulations concerning the seriousness of the voluntary pledges, they are critical. And the regulations, when you look, for example, the regulations we see in UK or European Union regarding deforestation, they're already moving the business in Brazil. The companies are trying to adapt to the new reality. Some very large commodity traders are creating new financial platforms to support the transition of their supply chains. So money is already flowing. It creates some opportunity and a pressure for us to make a move. So regulations are critical, but they must be drafted with the cooperation of all of us, not only in a cabinet, but with the cooperation on the ground. So if you don't have this kind of concern of creating regulations that are applicable in each and every level, they are social inclusive, they are supporting fair transition, it's a regulation that will be put in place, but with a lot of harm, a lot of collateral damages that were totally unnecessary.
Thank you for that. Marcelo, would love to hear further from you. We've heard about some of the supply and demand side, regulatory evolution and needs. Would you share a few further thoughts on that?
Sure, thank you so much for that. So first on national regulations, right? So we've been operating with biodiversity, I told you, since '98. And Brazil has discussed for 10 years how to put together a law on biodiversity and to enhance the use of biodiversity and connecting science, production, and traditional communities, and that happened, and it was edited in 2015. I think a lot of learning coming from there, and when Sonotrim Co. is a holding company that acquire here brands like The Body Shop, Aesop, and Avon, and all of them have the same issues, so they have to be taken on that journey, and we started to connect the dots on how we should connect with the elements that were put here in place. And what we observe being part of the carbon and the nature discussion for many decades now is that we think that the carbon discipline is well established. So we know by IPCC where we stand on science and how much carbon is being emitted, which are the main offenders, what we have to do. We understand politically via the Paris Agreement where each country is. We know the UK is around 350 million CO2 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year. We know where it was 20 years ago. We know that half of Brazilian emissions come from deforestation. So there is a big link there, and we know what we have to do coming forward with the NDCs. We know what each company is doing, and each macro organization has on its own science-based targets and how we are scoring in terms of carbon. And we know the exposure between, the connection between the economy, finance, risks via TCFD. We have to put the same regulation in place for nature. I think those are the four elements. We have IPBS being founded in Bonn and placing the concepts and how we are going to score nature. That's super important. We have CBD now with the new global biodiversity framework, establishing that each country has 2 years to put together its own NBCEP. And I think the task ahead for Brazil is to have its NBCEP. The same for science-based targets for nature and TNFD, connecting the dots between finance and what everyone is doing. What we have now is to incentivize, via financial incentives, the development of the cleaner, greener, and more positive nature economy. That's the task ahead for regulation, for sure.
Wonderful, thank you. One area where, of course, we now have the new global biodiversity framework, and so we expect a lot to ripple out from that, getting out to a more holistic and potentially systems-based approach, going well beyond regulations on deforestation. We don't have a lot of time, but I'd love to hear from Dr. Martin and Rashila in terms of your thoughts and how you're approaching biodiversity across value chains, right? Like deforestation is challenging but has an expansive toolkit, a lot of forward momentum. How about the biodiversity equation? How are you approaching that?
Maybe I start. Yeah, thanks. So we like to work in mini landscapes. Mini landscapes, I define that we are working with communities who are living within 5 kilometers of our concessions. If you do the maps, if you do the mapping, we are talking about areas of 100,000 hectares, 120,000 hectares, and then we can engage. I think everything starts with mapping, so the communities understand where actually the boundaries are, what are the features within the area where they are living, and then we are trying to connect these ecosystems, river protection areas, to work connecting those and give wildlife biodiversity the opportunity to move. Mini landscapes, we think they are a very effective tool to work because we know the players in that landscape. It's a relatively small group. If you go into, let's say, a province level in Indonesia, there are thousands of stakeholders there. It's very difficult to get proper representation from communities and indigenous peoples. If you work in mini landscapes, you can achieve that. What is very important for farmers in Indonesia often don't make the direct link between biodiversity and productivity. And so we are actually trying to demonstrate how biodiversity is increasing soil health, and soil health is producing higher yields, or at least the same yields with a lower amount of fertilizer, which then leads to lower cost for the farmer. Establishing kind of research plots, demonstration plots that the farmers can see these examples are an absolute key to convince them and follow you along that journey. And again, in mini landscapes, we have made very good experiences with that.
Really appreciate that in the sense of, and there are many, but win-win-win solutions that conservation of soil biodiversity can lead to lower costs and greater resilience across the board. So I appreciate that.
That said, just if investors in the room, it comes at a cost. Yeah, just to have the discussion and agree with the communities on conserving certain areas. We talk about $20,000, $30,000 US per village, and then the whole conservation costs in the long term will come as well. Which were mentioned before.
Well, hopefully the final panel of the day will give us all the answers on how we unleash the capital for those investments. Rashila.
So the main topic of this discussion is deforestation, and I was talking about engagement. That's just one aspect of it, and what we're working on at Robeco is we'll continue our engagement activities, whether it be on palm oil, soil, other soft commodities, separately or collectively. But in addition to that, we know that biodiversity is much, much broader than that, right? So we're working on developing what we call a biodiversity investment framework, where by each industries, mapping those industries to the drivers of biodiversity loss, the 5 drivers that come from IPBES, 4 actually, just because invasive species is very difficult to map to individual companies. What are the main drivers of biodiversity loss at that industry, defining KPIs that map to those drivers, and then having a methodology to be able to score companies in terms of whether they're relieving that pressure on the driver of biodiversity loss, whether it be land use change, whether it be exploitation, pollution, so on and so forth, or whether they're contributing to halting the loss of biodiversity. So the idea is, how can we look at biodiversity in a much broader spectrum rather than deforestation, rather than water pollution, and be able to have a view on which companies within a sector are leading and which ones are lagging. Because as investors, one of the things we always want to do is be able to compare against peers, right? So if you want to invest in a company in a particular industry, how can you identify the ones that, one, understand their risks, understand the opportunities, and are taking action towards that? And it's not just in one specific area. So all industries in all parts of the world, how can we have a view on how they're managing their biodiversity issues? In addition to that, that's informing the investment process, but also understanding from a financial risk perspective, as part of our group-wide risk assessment, we have a very solid process for climate-related risks and be able to quantify that. Now we're working to come up with an approach to understand our nature-related risks, starting with a heat map of where is our biggest exposure using tools like Encore, where 1/4 of all of our AUMs are invested in industries that have a high or very high impact on nature. 1/3 have a high or very high dependency on nature. So it's also, from a financial risk perspective, as investors, this is highly material. So at this point, we don't have perfect data. We'll never have perfect data. But we're already able to analyze, starting with a heat map, where are the priorities that we should focus on. How can we look at all investments from a biodiversity lens as needed, and what we need for the disclosures, whether it be for TNFD and so on and so forth. So taking a more holistic approach on biodiversity and how we apply that in a business like ours rather than trying to tackle it piecemeal without having that connectivity between the different topics.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I wish we had another half hour at least, because we really wanted to also talk about data availability and the role and managing data in this mix, and scaling investment in nature positive solutions across value chains. We won't have time for that. Hopefully the next panel will bring us in for a landing on some of those outstanding questions. In the meantime, I just really appreciate this rich mix of voices from different perspectives, really working and grappling with these challenges and seizing and driving forward momentum across this landscape, that we have this incredibly sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated and mature suite of tools to rely on for both investors and companies that we've been hearing about today, again, only scratching the surface, but also this palpable momentum with the convergence of implementation of the Paris Agreement, the net zero momentum, the global biodiversity framework, and more systems and holistic thinking, such as I think Jane from Global Commons Alliance was speaking to earlier, that it is striking when investors and companies that had just been beginning to, in some cases, grapple with addressing deforestation are now really broadening the lens to biodiversity and communities, people across systems and value chains. So thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us today. With that, I will introduce Romy Goedeke from the Nature Lead at UNEP FI, who will bring us in for a landing with our next panel.
Thank you, Sue. So I'll be trying to pick up the baton where Sue left it. And I'm very excited to be here for this panel for 3 reasons. First of all, we have a full house. Second of all, I have amazing speakers. You know, in English, people say, save the best for last. We definitely did that. But more importantly, money talks. And I think after discussing many other very relevant topics in the other session, this session is really going to dive into how can we actually accelerate finance at scale into nature-based solutions. So with that said, I want to invite my panelists up to the stage, and I know that they're a bit spread out. So we have Tim Christopherson, who is the Vice President Climate Action at Salesforce. We have Laura Berlow, who's the Group Head of Sustainability at Barclays. And then we also have Chip, who came in from the back, who is the Program and Risk Director at Aura. So whilst I climb on this slightly daunting chair, okay, it's working. I want to start slightly different than the other moderators have done. So I want to start with asking you all, you know, we've been talking a lot about nature, but in the same way, nature kind of been the elephant in the room because we haven't really spoken about nature, right? So I want to start with a question about what is your spirit animal? And I'll go first because mine is actually an elephant. Why do I love elephants? They're maternal animals, you know, and I love that. But what I love most about elephants is that they're strong and they're soft. And I think that's such an important combination. So with that said, can I hand over to you, Tim, for your spirit animal?
My totem animal is the eagle, but I also want to mention my family. We live on a family farm, and having one animal that you link to is not really a concept there. We had 16 little ducklings born yesterday. They're super yellow and fluffy, so they're my favorite animal of the moment, actually.
Super. And for those that want, there are pictures. So please approach them afterwards if you want to see a duckling. Can I ask you to continue, Laura?
Yes, thank you. And it's wonderful to be here with you all this afternoon and hear so many fantastic insights from all our speakers. I was thinking about my spirit animal. I was thinking the animal I would like to be, and then the animal I think is really the one I'm most closely aligned with. So I was thinking I'd like to be a giraffe, very sort of tall and elegant and looking down from the great heights. But I think I'm actually more like a bee. And I've actually been rewilding my garden. I live in the English countryside in Suffolk, and I've been letting my garden progressively rewild over the last 5 years. And the bee population is now extraordinary, and we now have hives. So I think I'm, pretty busy and active, like a bee, but also with a bit of a sting if I can't get things done, as my team would probably attest to. So I think I'll have to opt for the bee.
Wonderful, very brave. And then Chip, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I do a lot of work in the ocean space, so I sort of ought to have an ocean animal, but I know that at least when I was asked to think of my spirit animal, or at least look at it, I obviously did stuff online and found out I was a tiger, which is not a whale, which is what I was hoping for, but there we go, that's okay.
I was looking for something in the oceans, anything.
But I think I suppose part of that is around, at least the tiger is certainly around determination and the ability or the need to act fast. And I think, certainly for a tiger in the midst of the crisis that we are currently in, and indeed for that matter any animal in our world or on our world, and indeed in the ocean, I think yes, the need to act fast is sort of exactly the message that needs to be out there.
Great, super. So let's dive into the content. So UNEP's State of Finance for Nature report that was released just before COP15 said that we need to double investments into nature-based solutions by 2025, then double again, and then triple. What it also said is that at this moment, only about 17% of those investments come from private financial institutions. So in this session, we're really going to discuss how companies and private financial institutions and other initiatives really can drive investments into nature-based solutions. We'll speak about challenges, but hopefully we'll also speak about opportunities. And I'm also looking forward from my panelists to hear about examples. So I'm turning to you first, Laura, because Barclays is one of our most active members in the nature space. You've been piloting with us the draft beta framework that the TNFD has released. You're also part of our nature target setting working group. So I'm very interested to hear from you, firstly, about the overall climate and nature work Barclays is doing, and then also hear about how Barclays is integrating nature into your net zero transition plans, and then lastly, how do you manage deforestation risk? So I think a full agenda for you, Laura.
And I've got 2 minutes, I think, to cover all of that.
We got 5 minutes extra, okay, so please go ahead.
I will do my best. So I think a little bit like one of the speakers on the previous panel, I think actually Barclays was thinking about nature before it really started to focus on climate, with things like the Equator Principles and deforestation policy. And then climate became very much the priority. And in 2020, Barclays was one of the first banks to publish a net zero ambition, which seems really old hat now, doesn't it? Was quite a big deal 3 years ago. And a huge amount of our focus has been on setting the strategy and continuing to implement the TCFD, which we had been reporting under for a number of years already. But I think increasingly we have recognized that it's absolutely vital to integrate nature into our transition strategy and social impacts as well. I think those three things have to be considered together. And we've been doing that in a number of ways. One is very much learning from the experts. So we participate in a number of working groups. We use the Encore methodology to do a heat map of our portfolio, and then did a deep dive on our European agriculture portfolio using the LEAP methodology to really help us start to understand both the risks and the opportunities of our financing and the impacts of our financing on nature. Secondly, we're really looking at how do we integrate this into our transition plans, starting with a focus on our UK agriculture portfolio, because so much of target setting, baselining our emissions, but really importantly, target setting to reduce our climate impact will be about land use and understanding the complexity of those decisions and the potential trade-offs between addressing emissions and improving biodiversity and all the other nature metrics. So we're really looking to bring that to life through our work in our agriculture policy. Coming to your point on policy, as I said, we have a deforestation and agricultural commodities policy. We engaged a lot with a lot of civil society representatives, but also many of our institutional investors in reviewing that over the course of last year, and published an updated and much strengthened public position statement this year, which brought in South American beef, for example, for the first time, but also set in place the requirements for the companies we finance to look at their supply chains, not just at their own operations, to seek to be and commit to be deforestation free by 2025. So that was quite a step forward. I would say it's still work in progress. We don't have all the commodities covered there at the moment, and the key will be how well can we monitor that implementation, and that very much is a learning and work in progress for us. So I think those are some of the key areas, and we continue to participate in a number of working groups, including the Transition Plan Task Force here in the UK, actually in the Nature Working Group, to really look at how do we codify our work on nature into the transition plan guidance. So those are some of the areas we've focused on.
Wonderful, thank you, Laura. So as Thomas said in one of the earlier panels, you're one of these organizations that are in the race, that are trying and that are experimenting. And I think that is exactly what we need, because nobody has the final answers yet. So I'm turning to you, Tim. Your nature positive strategy released just in April says we must create a net zero and nature positive world together. Can you explain how this new strategy helps you to streamline and also upscale Salesforce work to support nature conservation and restoration and to help your climate ambition?
Thanks, Romy, and thanks to the Conduit for bringing us together. I started my career in the European Commission and then worked for ICN for 5 years and then the UN the last 15 years, including 5 years at the CBD. We've never been at this point before. I think what is so exciting about this is that we're at a social tipping point now where the economic invisibility of nature is giving way to a new economic paradigm. So that palpable excitement is also taking root in the private sector. And at Salesforce, we've launched our Nature Positive strategy last month. For those of you who don't know Salesforce, a global technology company, we make business-to-business solutions. It's about a $30 billion company, 75,000 staff. We also have about 50,000 NGOs as clients, so a lot of NGOs are run on Salesforce. And when we launched the strategy, we thought, what is it that we can uniquely bring? For us, nature action is climate action, and climate action is nature action, but it goes beyond that, because we also, of course, need to first and foremost reduce our emissions. We have an emission reduction target of 50% by 2030. Nature is an enhancer and enabler and catalyst for our climate action and our reduction of emissions. Our nature strategy has 3 pillars. The first is reduce our own impact, obviously. We piloted TNFD, sent them many pages of feedback. They're still in the room. Thanks for taking much of that on board. So, for example, data centers use a lot of energy. They also use a lot of water. Where does that come from? Freshwater ecosystems. The second pillar of our strategy is investing in restoration at scale. We lead a global movement with 82 other companies called the Trillion Trees Initiative, 1t.org, where we're investing in nature restoration at scale. And the third pillar, perhaps Salesforce's most important contribution, is enabling our customers to enter this space. Salesforce has 150,000 companies that we work with. Many of them talk to us. They're sustainability teams. We exchange information. Just tomorrow, we bring 40 of them together to talk about nature restoration priorities and how to do that. So that enabler, as a data company, because much of this is a data challenge, to make this space easier for companies is probably our biggest lever for change as Salesforce. Just wanted to add one point on the private sector engagement. There's a huge difference between voluntary and compliance action. And what is so important now is that much of what we talk about becomes compliance. Because when we were at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit in 2014, and there was the New York Declaration on Forest, which sounded fantastic. It was a lot of voluntary declarations. About less than 10% of the companies that signed made significant progress. Now we're at compliance. There's CSRD coming. There's Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. That changes everything. So getting ready for that challenge, getting ready for that data challenge as well, is a big part of what we want to contribute to this movement.
Thank you so much, Tim. And you worked in the UN system for a long time, so you'll recognize this saying that it needs to be a dance between the public and private sector, and each moving ahead. And thank you also so much for your reminder that we're in a unique moment in time when the stars seem to align for both nature and climate. So I'm turning to you, Chip, with a question. Firstly, for the people in the audience that might be less familiar with what Aura is, if you can explain what is Aura and how are you catalyzing, scaling and accelerating investments in marine and coastal areas?
Yeah, thank you, Romy. Look, so ORA is the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance. It was set up in 2019 after there was an ocean risk summit that took place in Bermuda. And at that, we brought together insurers and banks and others from the private sector, from civil society, from governments, really to talk about the implications of ocean risks and how the insurance and indeed the private sector and governments and others should collaborate to develop solutions to those, specifically focused on nature-based solutions. And so ORA is really this alliance of members, over 75 at the moment, of governments and private sector and insurers and banks and others, really to drive investment into nature. And that, the real goal is by 2030 to make 250 million people more resilient to climate and ocean risks around the world. Now, the aim is to drive $500 million. Now, that's a pretty small number in reality, but in terms of the ocean space, that's quite large. And so we are looking to drive that through the development and identification of a pipeline of projects. And so the role that I play really within ORA is around that identification of investable opportunities for small-scale investors, but also for grants as well. That's a lot of the work we do, focused on nature-based solutions, as I said, small-scale fisheries, around developing blue carbon from mangroves. In fact, we're doing a lot of work with our friends at Salesforce, who's also a member. And we are really sort of focused on driving that and identifying that pipeline. The second piece, very briefly, is around the missing middle. So the area where we're sort of looking at between sort of $5 and $10 million, where those companies don't tend to get a huge amount of investment. So we're setting up an investment fund, an impact fund. And the final piece of the puzzle is how do we drive governance work to bring in the hundreds of millions of dollars that need to be into the space.
Thank you so much, Tip. I know we still have 5 minutes. No worries, we'll finish on time. So I want to stay with you with a question about what we can do to bridge this financing gap, maybe speaking about one challenge, because I think people love challenges, but also opportunities. And I know you worked at AXA on this thematic before, so if you have examples from that time, those are welcome too.
Yeah, great, thank you. So, very briefly, I think 2 things. Maybe one is around data and the need for data to make decisions, and especially for investors who have a long-term time horizon. So we've been working with others within, some of our partners around developing a coastal risk index, so integrating coastal ecosystems into risk models for the first time. So when we're talking about nature, we need to be talking about it with the understanding and indeed using the words and I suppose the conversation that the investors and or insurers understand. And so we're developing this index to integrate those ecosystems into risk models so that as an investor, over the longer term time horizon, those ecosystems are more effectively managed. And then I think the final piece, just very briefly, given we've got very little time, is around financial literacy or financial ocean literacy when we're talking about the work that we're doing. And I think that that's a really critical piece of the puzzle where the ocean's never really been sort of part and parcel of the conversation. And indeed, how do we integrate the importance of the ocean in day-to-day decision-making when it comes to investments?
Wonderful. With the fear that we might be running over time slightly, I'm turning to Laura with the same question. One challenge, 2 opportunities, but try to keep it brief.
Yeah, I think data is critical, but I won't repeat what Chip said so eloquently. I think one challenge is ensuring we have the right policy and regulatory environment. I think policy sends incredibly strong and important signals. It's been really interesting seeing the impact of the UK government policy for house builders, requiring them to invest 10% of the project in biodiversity net gains, which is then going to generate new revenue streams for land protection and positive changes in land use. So I think advocacy and understanding and influencing the policy environment is key. And then I think the other is capacity building and knowledge sharing to actually allow capital to be deployed. We're hosting an event tomorrow with the Financial Services Task Force, part of the Sustainable Markets Initiative, bringing together insurers, banks and investors to look at the challenges, particularly in coastal financing, nature-based solutions, because while nature financing needs to go up at least 4x, it's about 20x for coastal-based financing. And then I would say the action is actually don't wait for all of that to be perfect. So we've set aside at Barclays 500 million of our own equity to invest into early stage clean tech companies, many of those clean technology companies, but also in things like a company called eConcrete that has biodiverse positive building materials for the marine environment in vertical farming, and in other early stage companies, usually in that critical gap that Chip just talked about, that sort of 5 to 10 million financing gap, to try to help them scale more quickly. And then right at the other end of the scale, I think it's looking at how do we use blended finance, so that's bringing together public and private capital to do really significant scale interventions. So I don't know if you saw the Debt for Nature swap that was done in support of the Galapagos, which I think is being very closely studied by lots of institutions, including my own. I think that's a fantastic blueprint, which also alleviates the cost of debt for low-income countries and allows them to invest that capital back into nature. So I think there are some really encouraging and exciting examples.
Excellent. And then Tim, over to you, and then even snappier.
So I usually speak to rooms full of other companies these days. So this audience is an expert audience, so I'll say something slightly different. We have to keep pushing to make the economic value of nature visible. We have to pay for what we use. That's the paradigm shift, and that's a systemic shift. That's not at the level of a company. We have a $100 million ecosystem restoration and climate justice fund. That's peanuts compared to the scale of the challenge that has to come from an all-of-society effort called Nature Positive. What I usually tell other companies is just to start, because there's a lot of FOMO or FOFU in the private sector world, but there's also a lot of peer pressure, constantly looking what their peers are doing. So if some companies really move far and fast ahead, it pulls a lot of other companies with them. But we need that systemic shift, and for that we need regulation, we need the best science, we need pioneers in the private sector. So we can have the speed and the scale of the transformation that we now need.
Excellent. FOMO. I'll add one more before we wrap up. I would say fail. So a fail is a first attempt in learning. So I think we need to dare to fail more. So I hope you join me all with a big applause for my excellent panelists. And over to the last session.
Rich, oh, there we go. Rich, deep conversations, and really appreciating the attention and energy of everybody in the room and dialing in online. Do whatever you need to do. Just move around, rock your feet up and down, feel the energy, bring the energy back into your body, because what we're going to do is we're going to give all of our attention and focus to our fabulous closing speaker, Manuel Vidal. But before we do, I'm just going to ask you to do one thing. Just lower your gaze, close your eyes if you like, and just think about what's your takeaway from today's conversation. We've heard so many different perspectives. We've dived in deep around nature positive for climate action. And what's the thing that you're taking away from today's conversation? And when that's clear, you can quietly sit down. You might want to write that down, make a note of it. And as you do, I'm delighted to welcome Manuel Vidal to share his closing thoughts on today's session.
Thank you, Melanie. Friends, it has been a fantastic session. I am sure that you all have enjoyed all the panels, all the words, all the ideas, to work towards a nature positive for climate action. So I will try to summarize in no more than 5 minutes, some of the key ideas that we have heard today. First one, urgency. Urgency, that is key. We are in a tipping point. Somebody said a social tipping point. But also our window of opportunity is tiny, is short. We know that we are in the decisive decade in case of climate, but on the other hand, we have to halt and reverse nature loss, as it has been well said by the GBF in the goal 1. Halt and reverse, that is the nature positive concept. Second, the importance of science. When we think about science, it is not only IPCC and IPBES, that it is fantastic what they are producing, how well they are modeling what it could be our future if we are not able to act. But also, as it has been said, the Earth system boundaries. So important because it is the only way to address the whole system and its interconnection. It is about nature, climate, health, and all the other boundaries that we know, that we have heard about it. Third, finance. And finance, it is not just about money or flows of money, that for sure we do need it. But it is more than that. It is financial risk assessment. It is to valuing nature. And as it has just been said, to make that valuing of nature more visible. It is so important to have that. And also to connect it with the economy. So all the financial side, it is so important. 4, work across sectors and within sectors. When we think about climate, we know, and probably it is easy to us to understand that it is about the 4 transitions suggested by science: energy, industry, infrastructure and cities, and land use and deforestation, and agriculture for sure. But we do need to work strongly in defining more clearly how to organize sectors for nature. Because it is by doing that that we would be more able to push them, to have more clear targets and to fulfill with those targets. So to organize sectors and to work within and across sectors, it is clear. 5th, keep the vision. And it is amazing. Despite that the Global Biodiversity Framework has not mentioned nature positive as a concept, for everybody is becoming a key concept, a key way to frame our vision for a better future. So let's continue working towards the nature positive concept. And let's give more content to the nature positive concept, because it is not just about a title. It is about a clear content. That moves me to the 6th one, action. That means commitments. That means that we have to recognize that nature, it is our ally, but also to recognize that we are not starting from scratch. We have heard about a lot of commitment from different actors. And as Razan mentioned in the beginning of today's session, we can work based on the race to zero, the race to resilience, the sectorial breakthroughs, among many other ideas that can help us to accelerate and to mobilize real action. 7, inclusiveness. We have to work with indigenous people and local communities. That is key. And that is the way in which we can build a bottom-up process with them. It is not only by considering them or by including them, it is by respecting them, by listening to their voices. And that is the way, for example, in which we could be more able to address nature-based solutions as an effective tool. 8, standards and metrics to promote compliance. Because compliance, it is key. And the only way to promote compliance, it is by having standards and by having metrics. We are in the climate debate trying to recover credibility. And we have to recover that credibility. We do need to have clear standards and to push and to encourage all the actors to follow and to fulfill those standards. We have clear standards for the net zero. Still, there are many other things to be developed. And now we have SBTN that it is working in a standard for nature. And we have to see how much we can do that a mandatory framework. Because to create compliance, it is a key element. 9, to connect with the economy. We do need to promote a better link in between nature and the economy. And today we have heard of very interesting economic activities that are working because of a strong and good connection with a sustainable management of nature. And that is the idea. It is to show that also it is possible to develop economic activities by a sustainable management of nature. That could create, as a best practice, or as a good practice, a good model for the future. And finally, opportunities. I am a lawyer by training, and somebody in the last panel mentioned policy, and I said, wow, finally. Because policy is important. Policy can bring you the opportunity. Because it is true. This economy or policy, it is a chicken and egg. What it should be the first? The two. Each one of those could lever the other. The importance to create opportunities by having clear policies, but on the other hand, creating the correct incentive, economic incentives, are key. Let me finish by saying that all of this event has been a call to action. A call to action to integrate nature in your own actions, in your own economic activities, in your own initiative. Second, to promote more investment, because we are all the time talking and looking on how to unlock the trillions. So we have to create the conditions to unlock those trillions, to promote more investment, because everybody knows that we have at the top risk of the world climate, water scarcity, and biodiversity loss. So we have to address those risks by investing more on nature. Then we have to define and fulfill a standard, because remember, nature can protect us if we protect nature. So on behalf of the high-level champions of the action and the nature agenda, thank you very much for this opportunity. I am not sure if you will announce something that it is more funny, a cocktail, but thank you very much.
I am the only thing that stands between you and cocktails, which is an unenviable position to be in. I want to just end by thanking this remarkable partners, the partners and the organizations that helped support this today and to support Nature Positive. So let's just pause, take a look at who they are, and do a big round of support to all the partners. Thank you. So those of you who have responded and RSVP'd, there are drinks on the 5th floor. Those of you who haven't RSVP'd and responded, there are drinks on the 5th floor. So please head up there and meet people and enjoy the terrace. And thanks so much for coming.